Hello everyone, it's Jabari here. Today's video is a patron request. If you would like to make a video request of your own, you can do so by becoming a patron. A link to this can be found below. Liberia. A country of 4.7 million people belonging to 20 unique ethnic groups. A number that is growing rapidly as the average Liberian woman gives birth to about 5 children throughout her life. Due to a combination of Liberia's high fertility rate and its high mortality rate from local disease, over half of its population is under the age of 25. This small country was also one of the 3 West African countries most heavily plagued by the 2014 Ebola outbreak, along with the neighboring countries of Guinea and Sierra Leone. To add insult to injury, the country is still recovering from 2 bloody civil wars, the most recent one ending just a decade ago. My intentions were not to create a video that perpetuates negativity, but it is necessary that I put this out there ahead of time in order to fully dissect the context of this video. So let's get started with the founding of the modern day country of Liberia. Prior to the formation of the modern day country, Liberia was composed of a collection of small kingdoms and chiefdoms. Among these were the Kru people, a resilient group who were popularly regarded as expert sailors and advocated a culture that chose death over being taken into slavery. Early European merchants referred to the area as the Pepper Coast, and eventually, the Grain Coast. And I'm sure you can probably guess why. As much as I'd like to continue talking about the early history of this area, the purpose of this video is to discuss the modern state of Liberia. So let's continue. In 1816, white Americans saw the ever-growing threat of black American freedmen as their numbers continued to grow at an alarming rate. In response to this, they founded an organization known as the American Colonization Society. It was originally founded with the intentions to relocate black freedmen from the South and into areas where they would not pose any potential threat to the stability of slave owners or their plantations. However, over time, it would become dominated by people who were largely anti-slavery activists who wanted to relocate blacks for humanitarian reasons. Their goal was to move black people to a place where they'd be able to live in a society that treated them as equals and thus allow for a better chance to lead successful lives. The United States wanted to establish a colony in Africa to do just that. Though this plan sounded good on paper, there were a few major problems with it. Problem number 1 was that the indigenous peoples of Liberia were unwilling to sell any land to the United States for the establishment of this colony. The settlers had to take refuge on the nearby Scarebough Island until they were able to procure territory on the mainland. These American ships sailed all along the coast of West Africa, searching for suitable land to establish the colony, but every group they encountered declined any offers to sell their lands. Eventually, Naval Officer Lieutenant Robert Stockton forced a local leader to sell a strip of land to them. As a result of this, his newly established African colony was continuously attacked by locals in 1824 and had to be fortified to avoid being overrun. The second problem is that blacks being sent to this area likely did not descend from locals, and thus could not relate to the indigenous peoples or their ways of life. And problem number 3 was that even if they were ethnically related to the locals, most of them were born and raised in the United States, given American names, and therefore accustomed to American language, culture, religion, and overall ways of life, which greatly differ from that of the local practices. This led to tensions between the locals and the immigrants, but we'll cover that shortly. For now, we'll continue discussing the formation of Liberia. After being fortified and protected from angry locals, the colony was named Liberia in 1847, and its capital was named Monrovia, in honor of President James Monroe, as he was credited with supplying much of the funds to the project from the US Treasury. In addition to the initial point of settlement, other colonization societies purchased more land to add to the colony and sent thousands of slaves who were freed after the abolition of the slave trade. Because it was not internationally recognized as a sovereign state, European merchants continuously undermined Liberia's influence by trading in and out of its borders without permission. The British were the ones to first recognize the Republic of Liberia, making it the first republic in Africa, and they signed treaties of friendship and commerce in the year 1848. Despite the United States' foundational role in the founding of Liberia, they still did not recognize Liberia as a sovereign state, likely due to fears of the impact that it would have on slavery. As a result of this, no massive migration of freed slaves ever happened, even though that was the basis of Liberia's establishment in the first place. It wasn't until late 1862 that the United States finally recognized Liberia's sovereignty and established official relations with them. Over the next century, ties between Liberia and the United States remained close, perhaps too close. Freed slaves began to pour in and make this place into their home. During this time, heavy modernization began to trickle along the coast where schools, hospitals, and local shipbuilding industries and trade expanded rapidly. Another thing that happened during this time was an attempt to establish firm control over the native populations further inland. But these attempts were halted after the American Colonization Society withdrew its funding, leaving Liberia to depend on exports of local raw materials and agricultural products, which did not generate enough income to modernize their nation. As a result of this, they were forced to take out massive loans from foreign lenders to compensate. In 1909, the Liberian government officially declared bankruptcy. With assistance largely from the United States government, Liberia was able to climb out of its hole, but followed up with poor economic decisions and relied heavily on foreign leases and loans to bring revenue into the country. These foreign leases and loans only served to worsen Liberia's financial burdens. To make matters even worse, tensions between the American descendant blacks and the indigenous peoples were high throughout the history of Liberia. The ruling minority, for example, was composed entirely of americo-liberians, which was an ethnic group that descended from the founding wave of freed slaves in the early 19th century, who composed just 5% of Liberia's population, yet controlled the majority of the government and its wealth. These americo-liberians built their government and economic structure to mirror that of the United States, utilizing the same language, architecture, laws, government, and social hierarchy. Even the flag of Liberia mirrors that of the American flag. Liberia also shows clear American influence in the fact that it has not yet adopted the metric system. This brings me to another problem to add to the list of problems that I brought up earlier. Americo-Liberians viewed themselves as a distinct and superior ethnic group to the locals, in a system similar to that of the Jim Crow laws in America or apartheid of Southern Africa. They did not integrate with the local Africans and largely married only other Americo-Liberians exclusively, all the while retaining their own ethnic identity, culture, and ways of life. Perhaps through centuries of brainwashing by their white masters back in the United States, their government, architecture, society, and culture showed clear influence from the plantations of southern United States, and what had been done to them by whites was now being done by them to the locals. Throughout their history, they did everything they could to keep their people in power, all the while subjugating the locals to intense discrimination, in addition to persistent attempts at civilizing them and promoting Western morals and values. One of the worst examples of this happened during an economic crisis in the year 1930, where they utilized indigenous people as forced laborers, in a system hardly distinguishable from slavery. Shortly after, the government was overthrown and the president was replaced by Edwin Barclay, who proceeded to re-evaluate the laws of Liberia. Over the next few decades, new mineral wealth was discovered, which increased government revenue and allowed for modernization to continue along the coastal regions. However, the interior populations that were almost entirely composed of indigenous people remained neglected and underdeveloped by the government. In 1944, President William Tubman allowed locals to participate in mainstream social and economic offices, and even allowed them the right to vote. Despite all of these changes, the Americo-Liberians still controlled the vast majority of the wealth and power of the nation, and the gap between them and the locals only widened. So he took more questionable approaches, such as allowing himself to have 7 consecutive terms in office, where he could remain until his death in 1971. By this time, the patience of the indigenous people grew thin, and they became increasingly less tolerant towards their americo-liberian rulers. Since most of the country lived in poverty, President William Tolbert tried to promote local industry by raising prices of imported goods, which were met with intense criticism from the locals. As a result of this, a 1980 military coup led by Samuel Doe murdered the president and 13 of his cabinet members, establishing a new government which they called the People's Redemption Council. This government, however, proved to be arguably even more corrupt than the former, as the leader of the coup, Samuel Doe, was unpopular and actually declared himself the winner of the election that took place 5 years later, despite the fact that he had actually lost. This new government was also inexperienced and unfit to rule. He also showed obvious biases towards the Krans, the indigenous ethnic group to which he belonged. This was done in a manner no different from the corrupt americo-liberians that this coup had overthrown. He then proceeded to shut down newspapers and political activity, and further stirred the pot with other indigenous ethnic groups who were formerly peaceful towards one another. Disgruntled with yet another corrupt government, thousands of people sought refuge across the Liberian border into the Ivory Coast. There, Charles Taylor, a former deputy minister who allegedly was imprisoned for theft of government funds, organized and trained 100 of these refugees. In 1989, he marched his force into Liberia, where thousands of Liberians from all backgrounds joined him. Within a year, Taylor's army captured and executed Samuel Doe, which led to a full-on civil war. After 5 years of brutal warfare, the Economic Community of West African States, the UN, the United States, the European Union, and the Organization of African Unity got involved. Yes, a lot of people involved, and convinced Charles Taylor to agree to a ceasefire, which only lasted 2 years. Charles Taylor then went on to win a presidential election in 1997. During his election, the violence slowed but did not completely end, and it is believed that he was working out deals secretly from neighboring countries to hire guerrilla mercenaries and purchase arms and luxuries for himself and for former members of his army. The war resumed in 1999 before finally coming to an end in 2003, with Taylor's exile after the United States offered a $2 million reward for his capture. Finally, in 2006, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected as the president of Liberia, becoming the first ever female head of state anywhere in Africa, and what would be declared as one of Liberia's least corrupt elections ever. She began her term with a lot on her plate, as she was tasked with cleaning up the massive damage to the country's infrastructure and economy that had taken place during the Civil Wars. Despite her involvement in Taylor's rebel army, she proved to be an effective leader, virtually removing all of Liberia's national debt and establishing an organization called the Anti-Corruption Commission in 2008 to counter the country's corrupt government. In January of 2018, she was succeeded by George Weah, a former soccer player who was criticized for having no formal education in politics. He famously responded to these remarks by saying, "With all of their education and experience, they have governed this nation for hundreds of years. They have never done anything for the nation." Liberia is now slowly experiencing recovery to its infrastructure and economy after decades of warfare and plagues, and only time will tell how the country fares with power being more evenly distributed among the locals rather than being firmly grasped by the americo-liberians. The newer leaders of the nation seem to have taken a stand against repeating the same corrupt patterns of the past, and instead paving a fair and progressive path for their future. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Also be sure to join the Empire from Nothing, our Discord community where you can hang out and chat, where topics like these are discussed 24/7. The link can be found below. And always remember, we don't come from nothing.